Okay, we're slightly behind schedule, but hopefully next speaker is Gary Severson, and he wants to talk about Oswald and North Dakota. And he's a native North Dakotan. He's presently a social studies teacher at John F. Kennedy High School in Bloomington, Minnesota. He's been following the JFK assassination research since the late 60s, and his own research developed in the late 80s as he studied Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans. In 1999, John Armstrong encouraged him to pursue Armstrong's North Dakota Lee Harvey Oswald connection, which resulted in a series of articles in the 2000 issues of the Fourth Decade. And included in this research is a segment dealing with North Dakotan Edward K. Thompson, Life magazine editor at the time of the assassination. Thanks.
Thanks, John. I called John about a week ago, and I thought as long as I'm coming, I might as well see if there's room for me, and put me on the short list, and so here I am. And I saw somebody doing a speech once, and they answered their cell phone. I'm not going to do that. I've been, when you're from North Dakota, and you want to talk about the JFK assassination somehow being associated with North Dakota, you got to say something that has a hook, okay? And the hook is, you sitting down for this? I've been researching the assassination for 47 years and 2 months. And I've been associated with the Secret Service on 2 occasions. Once 47 years and 2 months ago, and once 2 years ago. And on both occasions, I accidentally, not quite accidentally the second time 2 years ago, but both times basically accidentally breached their security. That tells me 2 out of 2 is not, that tells me that's standard operating procedure maybe. Anyway, here's the beginning of the idea that John Armstrong's idea that Lee Harvey Oswald appeared in a village in North Dakota is related to. And John, when I saw his reference to Lee Harvey Oswald appearing in North Dakota in the Dallas Monthly magazine, Dallas Monthly, I called him up and I said, I see that you say there's a letter from a lady in North Dakota saying that her son played with Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, that was the beginning of something that started 10 years ago. Okay, so that's this end of it. But 47 years, 2 months ago, I was almost in this picture. Okay, this is the helicopter that JFK landed in Grand Forks, North Dakota, on the second day of the conservation tour of 1963. And he's making his way from the helicopter to the arena, about a block and a half. That's not necessary, but for a long time, this guy I thought was a hitman. But then I realized that's how press guys dress with that piebald hat there, and I forgot about it. But in any case, this is Senator Burdick, this is Governor Guy. Help me with this one. It certainly looks like Greer to me. And I can't tell who that is. Now, my best friend and I, that morning, were excited about seeing JFK. And school wasn't let out. We were sophomores, we were 15 years old. And we had already been, prior to JFK's visit on September 25th, 1963, we'd been through hell about a year before. Because there's about a 10-mile gap between where JFK is right here and a nuclear base that has become infamous in war games. You know, when they got the big map up, they show Grand Forks, and it's one of the first. Well, we knew as kids that if there was a first strike, we were going to be one of the first 10 places to go, along with the Minot Air Force Base. Okay, so we went, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we went home at lunch,
And we actually said to each other, I hope we see you after lunch, to our buddies. Now, we were 15 years old. We had neighbors that had bomb shelters. We lived with this every day. Our neighbors were missile launch officers who would confide in us their second thoughts about what they were possibly going to have to do. So maybe that says something about the motivation we had to go see JFK, because I think we realized he had saved our butts the year before. We get here, we hitchhike 2 miles from our high school. Now, we grew up across from the field here where the helicopters land, and it's the University of North Dakota. We knew the inside of every building that we had been kicked out of for the last 15 years. And when we got here, there were I'd say 30,000 people around this field that was the size of 5 football fields, with lots of space for all the press to land and all the helicopters. So we were sure that if there's 30,000 people outside, there's no room inside. So we're kind of discouraged, but we have, the map of the place in our head, on the back of our hand, and we make our way. At this point, we're probably 200 feet this way from JFK's limo. We haven't seen him at this point. We don't realize. This is a picture that I, found and realized that we were 200 feet towards the arena. We approach the arena, and there's M16s on the roof. And we think, there's no chance we're going to get into this place. But we decided to go in a front door where the coaches' offices and the locker rooms were. It was a student athletic facility, but it had the arena that would hold about 15,000 people. So we get to the first door, and lo and behold, it's open. Go through a second and a third door. Not a soul in sight. Now we're in the student locker room. And we know there's a couple doors ahead that go right onto the arena floor, but we know a better way up the back stairs that has a door that opens right into the arena. We go up the stairs. Again, handball courts, basketball courts, offices. You could hear a pin drop. There was literally not a soul in sight. Open the door. Of course, the place is full. There's no place to sit. We're going to be standing. And I keep scanning, and I see 2 empty seats right in front of the podium. Of course, there's a gap of 25 feet for security. And at the time, now I say, I know those were my seats. So we make our way through the crowd, and we get there, and here's an agent. It is that day, the particular color for the glass button was maroon. And he's scanning the crowd. Now, we're 15 years old. We sit down right in front of him, like right here, this close. He doesn't even bat an eye. He doesn't look at us for an instant, because I'm watching him. And, 10 minutes later, Kennedy comes in. He's getting an honorary degree. He has his robe on. The first 20 rows that are ticketed just literally go ballistic. It's like, most of them are co-eds, of course, 20 years old, and they somehow got their tickets in the front row. They're literally on the chairs, pulling their hair, screaming. It's like, Mick Jagger walked in or something. I don't know. He gets them calmed down. He gives a speech, and at the time, the speech didn't really register. I looked at it later, and proud of the fact that he was already emphasizing the environment. And the day before, he'd been in Duluth, the night before, and he had flown over the Apostle Islands with Gaylord Nelson 10 years before Nelson creates Earth Day. And he was asked by Nelson to make the Apostle Islands into a national seashore, in effect a national park. So his speech at the University of Minnesota Duluth that night was also of that orientation, because this was a conservation tour of 1963. He'd done it the year before, and he wanted to do it again. Well, he finishes the speech and he leaves. He flies to Laramie, Wyoming, gives a speech at the University of Wyoming at about 2 o'clock. He goes to Billings, gives a speech there, and then stays that night at Jackson Hole. And that night, September 25th, is when the White House, according to Vince Palomera, decided that they would agree to go to Dallas and extend the Texas trip by 1 day. Now, I don't know what that has to do with the fact that I walked through those 5 doors. But for 45 years, it was in the back of my head. And finally, on the 45th anniversary, the Grand Forks paper does a story on the fact that he had received an honorary degree 45 years before. You know, it's a big deal when, especially JFK comes to a town. You don't forget. And in the story is an interview with the man in charge of security that day. And I knew him. I knew of him. He lived 2 blocks from where my mother still lives, 2 blocks beyond this chimney. Okay? I got roots. And so the fact that 45 years later, this guy who's now 90 and could have been dead 30 years prior surfaces, and I recognize him. I call him up and I say, I got a question. Can we meet for coffee? Sure. I show him John Armstrong's book, and he's pretty curious. You know, he takes it, and I don't think he ever. I had him read the section on North Dakota, okay, which of course John Armstrong says is the Stanley, North Dakota appearance of Lee Harvey Oswald is the first incidence of a seemingly doubled up Oswald. Okay. Well, I said to Mr. Penn, who was a journalism professor at the university and was in charge of Kennedy's visit, including security. I said, this is what happened that day. Why? He said, I don't know, maybe the custodians forgot to lock those doors. And that's all I could get out of him that day. And we made small talk. I said, I'll be back in a month. I live in Minneapolis. I'll be back to visit. He said, give me a ring. I go back. We meet at a coffee shop. I said, Mr. Penn, have you thought of anything else about why those doors were open? And he said, that morning at 7 a.m., just like that morning at 7 a.m., I gave the keys to the Secret Service. Those doors all should have been locked by the time you walked through them at 10 o'clock. Well, I finally had my answer 45 years later. And still don't know what it means. You know, you can be dishonest with yourself and start to think about, I prevented the assassination. And I don't think for a minute that's what happened. I met with him 3 or 4 more times. And he started to keep me more and more at arm's length and be more reticent to talk. Finally, I'm at his house, and we're sitting and we're going to start conversing. And he leans over to me and looks me in the eye and he says, you don't think I was involved, do you? I said, you know, I hadn't really thought that. I mean, you know, maybe it had crossed my mind that he knew something else. And I said, no, John, no, you know. I didn't know what to say. It was kind of a shock. I mean, why would you say that unless there was something else you knew about giving the keys to the Secret Service that morning? Now, you got to know Grand Forks in North Dakota. I mean, it's as corrupt as any place. It's by the Canadian border. That means corruption, prohibition, the 30s, 40s, and it didn't go away. I had friends that were married into the Bronfmans in Winnipeg, okay? Now, where I'm going with this is that is the Wisconsin Oswald appearance in Rhinelander, and I always block on that, Sparta, Wisconsin, about 30 miles east of La Crosse. Those supposed appearances of Oswald were as clear as what happened in Stanley, North Dakota. The only difference is there was a letter from the woman in Stanley, North Dakota to LBJ on December, early part of December, according to John. This is the letter that John finds and that I'm responding to by following his suggestion that I'm up there, why don't you go look? Well, I've talked to all the people that supposedly had something to do with the 15-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald in 1953. Now, this is all in the fourth decade. There's a series of 3 articles specifically dealing with North Dakota. So we don't have time to go into all the details. When I told Peter Dale Scott about the context, he said, well, are you sure? Are you sure that what they report happening actually happened in 53, implying that it may have happened in 63? In other words, it was concocted in 63. So when we're in Stanley, North Dakota, somebody says to us, oh, you got to talk to so-and-so also. Now, the person that played with Lee Harvey Oswald in 1953 at 15 years old had left North Dakota a long time ago, like a lot of people do, including Clint Hill, who I just talked to over there at the 7th floor. It took me 47 years to catch up with him. And we didn't have much conversation, except he said, tell your high school students back in Bloomington at JFK High School that don't believe any of the conspiracies. I didn't have any time with him, of course, so I couldn't argue, but it was tempting. He was starting to sign books. So we're in Stanley, North Dakota, and we're told, you got to go talk to this other guy. Well, here we find another guy who hardly knows Bill Timmer, who John Armstrong says was the playmate of Lee Harvey Oswald. And he independently corroborates the same kind of experience. Okay? And so now we think, well, you know, Peter Dale Scott had a heck of a way to look at that, but now we got 2 people. And the second one talks in terms of this 15-year-old coming to Stanley, North Dakota. It's during the oil boom, 1953. Okay? So you got people from all over the country. And it's not unusual to hear people with Louisiana accents. Well, this man tells us that this Lee, even he says Lee, asked him to go to Cuba and suggested running guns.
No, said place. I can't talk on a...
Now, the guy that we're not expecting to find, he says, well, it wasn't 1953. It was 1955 or 56. Well, now it's a little more difficult to get your head around Lee Harvey Oswald being in this little village in North Dakota in 53 and 56. But the long and short of it is, when I started talking to the people scattered around the country who had had the experience and wondered why they were interviewed by the FBI on December 23rd, 1963, in Stanley, North Dakota, and other parts of the country, but a lot of them hadn't left in 63. Their story isn't as clear. It's not like, you know, you don't exactly remember the details of who you're playing with at 15 years old if they were only there for a short time. But it was right down to the neighborhood where the experience was. Well, the second guy we found, Lyle Aho, A-H-O, a good Finnish name, who passed away a couple of years ago, 5 years ago. It turns out he's from a family of Finnish communists, as is a large contingent of people living in and around Stanley. And I'm thinking, yeah, I knew there were a lot of Finnish communists in northern Minnesota, but I'm from North Dakota. I didn't know about North Dakota. So now I'm a little more intrigued. I start digging. When I was a kid, I worked for the State Geological Survey, and I had a summer job in a oil core library. So I understood, you know, what was going on out in western North Dakota with oil. So I called their lab and I said, who's got all the land leased for oil around Stanley? And it was real easy to discover that it was Hunt Oil, that it was that, of course, the oil field services company, Halliburton, was there, Brown and Root was there, and a lot of these people worked for all those companies that were familiar with it. Now, my speculation is that with all these commies living around Stanley, North Dakota, Hunt is just foaming at the mouth, you know, and he's going there. And my next door neighbor happens to be the state petroleum engineer. That's why I get the job. And he's telling me his meetings with H.L. Hunt are just off the wall in Bismarck in the 50s and early 60s, trying to get Hunt to do paperwork so he can drill. And all Hunt wants to do is talk about killing Kennedy. Just rabid. To the point where some days my next door neighbor says, I just leave the room. I'd walk down the hallway and I could hear him ranting about killing Kennedy. Now this, you know, Hunt is probably 80 and mostly blind by now. So, you know, where I went with that was to suggest that there were plots preceding Dallas, including Chicago, and the fact that Dick Russell has Nagel infiltrating with Oswald the cell in Cuba, the anti-Castro Cuban cell, and they say we're gonna hit Kennedy at the end of September. When I saw that, and I'll leave it with that. When I saw that, I went back because I thought I had seen Kennedy 40 years prior to that, late September, and sure enough, there it is, September 25th. Nagel got himself arrested on September 20th in El Paso when he staged the bank robbery. Maybe that he was derailing the assassination at that point, and the night of the 25th, they had Dallas. I'll leave it at that.
Can you say what the letter was? You started to talk about the letter that you always was based on. What was in the letter?
Oh, well, the letter from the woman in Stanley, North Dakota was not a very well-written letter, but it was describing the fact that she believed her son was playing with Lee Harvey Oswald because she had seen his pictures after the assassination, and she recognized this kid. And when I finally got in touch with her in Arizona, she was very willing to talk. Now, amazingly, there was a person in Portland, Oregon, who had maintained a friendship with this Bill Timmer, who was the playmate of Lee Harvey Oswald. I said, what do you think? He says, well, you know, I've never been able to figure out why I was interviewed by the FBI on December 23rd, 1963. And, you know, I've never dared ask Bill Timmer what he knows about it, but I'm going to. So then ensued his visits to Arizona, and Bill Timmer would deny that it had happened, even though he had told John Armstrong that it had. Thank you.
We're getting Peter Dale Scott up, but yeah, thanks. Stay a second. We're trying to get Peter Dale Scott up. Until we do, we could ask questions if you have them.
I've got a comment about the first part of the story. Is there somebody have me? I got a comment about the first part of the story, you know, when you were a kid.
Okay.
He just passed away, but I have a friend who was a newspaper man. He owned his own newspaper, and in 1960, he was a journalist. And I can't remember the specifics. Yes. You want me to do that thing?
Just a recording part.
Okay. Okay. And Kennedy had won the election, and they had the inauguration and that. And there was a gathering at the Kennedy compound in Hyannis of journalists to meet him, maybe ask him some questions. And he had not been invited. So he wanted to go. So he knew where the bus was going to leave. I forget where it was going to leave from, but it was going from Boston to the Kennedy compound down in Hyannis. And he and another friend, another journalist, went to the bus. There was really nobody there. He got on the bus. Nobody checked them. Nobody checked the other press, the other journalists. They all drove down. They got into the compound. There was nobody at the compound, nobody in the rooms. They were waiting for him to show up. He came in. He had a cigar. He was drinking stuff with them and asking questions. And he said, if I wanted to, I could have killed him. I could have had a gun, and I could have killed him because nobody ever checked me, which is kind of similar to your story. But it doesn't go into the rest of your story. But they were very lax, very lax. And, of course, the bad guys knew that and knew they could pull off what they were going to do at some point. But anyway.
Sure, yeah. Well, just one more thing. 2 years ago, I'm at a campaign rally in North Dakota, in Grand Forks, same place that I saw Kennedy 47 years ago. And Hillary Clinton and Obama are coming through in the same day, and there's 20,000 people that sit in this domed football stadium for 6 hours between the two of them. The night before, I thought, gee, I wonder if security's as bad as it was 47 years ago, 45 years ago at that point. I went to the arena, and I walked down the concourse, and a private security guard stopped me, said, what are you doing? I said, oh, I'm just looking around. Struck up a conversation. There's agents locking doors. And then out of the blue, he says, my job tomorrow is escorting Obama through the kitchen from the ballroom where they're going to have a dinner. And I said, the kitchen? The kitchen? He hadn't heard about RFK's kitchen. And so I briefed him on that. The next day he came out of the kitchen onto the arena floor with Obama and walks over to me and thanks me for having told him about the kitchen. And I said, how'd it go in the kitchen? He says, no problem, no problem. Well, now he's got a story to tell his grandkids that sometimes people get assassinated in kitchens, and he prevented it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John, can you introduce yourself?